I love Carl. I love Carl so much. I love this stupid minecart brawler so much. So, I am going to be making a podcast video about why I love Carl so much. And I'm just going to be gushing about him for 30 plus minutes. No, I'm kidding. But what I will be doing is I will be coining a term after Carl that doesn't necessarily relate to Carl exclusively, but I will henceforth refer to as the Carl effect. So, if you're new here, these are podcast style videos where there's not going to be much on screen going on, so you can just listen while you're doing something else or whatever. I can't tell you what to do. But this is a video about Carl checks and something I'm going to be calling the Carl effect and why everyone in competitive is going crazy over Carl being good again. So, if you've been around the competitive scene, especially as of late, but even like up to a year ago from the last time Carl was good, or like every single time Carl gets buffed, people are always talking about, like, even when Carl is like kind of mid, not necessarily like one of the best brawlers in the game, people are talking about Carl and they're like, oh my god, Carl metas are so good, right? And we love when Carl's meta because he's just such a healthy brawler. Whether that's true or not, but people seem to have like this sort of attachment to Carl in competitive, and every time Carl isn't competitive, people seem to be having a lot of fun with it, and that especially applies to now. If you've been around Twitter or on Power League watching Queso Cup, ESL, monthly finals, you'd be aware that Carl has been seeing a ton of play, a ton of discussion, people calling him a top 5 brawler right now, again, whether that's true or not, but it's safe to say that everyone is going crazy over Carl. And why exactly? So, the thing that got me to make this video in the first place was, well, yesterday, I was watching Queso Cup. And during Queso Cup, there was this, it wasn't just in the match that I'm going to be talking about, but it was especially prevalent in this match. Two of my favorite teams in NA, Chazmac Gaming, I love Chazmac, and Vanguard Gaming, Vanguard and Chazmac Gaming. And their set against each other was so wild. Like, of course we saw all of like standard stuff, like we saw Bonnie being played, Janet banned, Carl being played, of course, but we saw something weird during Queso Cup, and I don't know if the announcers really talked about it much. Maybe they talked about it in a passing comment, or maybe during one match, but there was a lot of prioritization on Lou of all brawlers. And that's like super random because Lou, he got a while ago where he got super cool implemented into his base kit, but he hasn't been really like changed since. There haven't been like that many meta developments, and Lou hasn't been buffed ever since. And Lou has been kind of like an irrelevant or like a very, very niche brawler for a long time. And suddenly Lou is seeing play like everywhere. Like he's seeing play in Brawl Ball, in Ranged Heist. Like I know patchy memes about Lou on Safe Zone, but he legitimately carried a game with him on Kaboom Canyon. Seeing play on Double Swoosh, like Gem Grab in general, like Gem Grab, Brawl Ball, Heist, all these weird modes, and then he loses in Hot Zone of all places and wins everywhere else, which is just, it's so baffling. Like this random brawler that literally didn't get any changes is now just like suddenly this flavor of the month pick, and it's crazy, man. So I saw that and that got me thinking, like, what is, like, we didn't get that many meta changes, right? I know people were talking about the recent balance changes being kind of lackluster. Like, yeah, we got Grom being buffed, so now he's actually a good brawler. Carl's a really good brawler now. Penny got a massive buff, right? But not a lot of nerfs, and that's only like, I guess there are like 4 big changes, count the Eve nerf in that as well. 4 big changes, and the meta changed so much, but why? And so I landed on, and it was a tweet by ReadySet, something talking about how interesting Carl was to discuss right now. And I saw that and I was like, oh, and I got to connecting neurons, and now we're here. So, what is the Carl effect? Basically, I'm going to define this as whenever an incredibly solid but not broken brawler, like an A tier brawler if you want to talk in disgusting tier list terms, an A tier brawler that comes into the meta and that makes other brawlers that are tangentially related to them, like in terms of like matchup wise, like so when I say tangentially related, I'm gonna bring up another term that I used in a previous video about drafting, which is a check. So these brawlers that check them just come into the forefront of the meta, right? Or they rise like a major amount even though they didn't get any change. And the brawlers that are checked by this new extremely solid brawler coming into the meta move down slightly. So you see move up by a bunch of brawlers that are like tangentially related to this newcomer in the meta. You see a bunch of other brawlers move slightly down, right? And that has a radical effect on how the meta looks like. So, and I bring this up because, so yes, this has happened in metas prior, especially in whenever 6 bans came out and Bo and Lola came into the front, but I'm going to be talking about why that was less expressed then compared to now. But I think Carl is a very, very good example of this. And so whenever I say, so there's certain brawlers that are just seeing a lot more prioritization right now than in the previous meta. Maybe they weren't necessarily bad before, right? But they weren't nearly as common as they are right now. And so here, going over a bunch of examples about random brawlers I've seen like being heavily prioritized recently in Snapdragon and Queso Cup and monthly finals, right? So let's begin with there's like a few like random defensive CC options that they can beat Carl, right? I'm gonna be talking about one that does beat Carl pretty substantially, but it's just they're able to prevent you from losing to Carl. Because something Carl does really well is using Flying Hook and then supering your entire team, or supering one target and you just lose the game from there. It snowballs from there. Carl getting this insane pressure if you don't have any CC. So these CC brawlers that can prevent you from losing to Carl are now seeing a lot more play. I think some good examples of that are Jean, Gale, and of course the brawler that started this line of thinking from me, Lou. So Jean, I think Jean is the least extreme example of this. So Jean has been good, right? He's been seeing like a lot of play on a lot of different maps. Maybe he wasn't that prioritized on Canal Grande in the previous meta, but he was being played still quite a bit, right? He was still good on Canal Grande, good on Hard Rock Mine, good on like, well, there wasn't really a ranged gem grab map now, but he probably would have been okay on Minecart Madness before. He is, and let me preface this, Jean is very insane on Minecart Madness right now. Very, very good on Hard Rock Mine. And don't get me wrong, he wasn't a bad brawler or anything, right? But I would say he is one of the best like gem grab and bounty and knockout, like mid laner, ranged, whatever you want to call it. He is very, very, very good right now. Kind of mid before, he was like good, but nothing special, right? Now he is very, very good. It's simply because Lamp Blowout and his pull are very good abilities in order to prevent your team from losing to Carl. Because something you can do is, of course, if Carl tries to dash into your team, you can walk into, your teammates can walk towards you, get a Lamp Blowout, and suddenly Carl can't super into them, right? They get that peel, which is what it would be referred to in another MOBA. Healing is basically when you prevent, or like you just give support to something, right? You peel for your teammate, right? And that's what Lamp Blowout can do against Carl, right? You also have pull because Carl doesn't have any way to body block a pull, and he is just food for a really good or a really nasty, really meaty Jean pull, right? So Jean now not necessarily counters Carl. Like he has these tools to deal with Carl, but Carl still has like this ranged prowess over him. He still chunks him for like 2,000 damage at range, right? If the Jean isn't running Lamp Blowout, like he kind of forces Jean to run Lamp Blowout, and on some ranged maps, Jean really wants to run Vengeful Spirits. So it's not like it's a one-sided match for anything, but Gene just prevents your team from losing to Carl, right? And because Gene is also just a fine brawler in every other department, he now has like this new niche that he's able to deal with this new top brawler in Carl. Now suddenly he's at the forefront of the meta, right? Very similarly to Gale, right? I don't think anyone was calling Gale a bad brawler before. Actually, in the last meta, I kind of saw a cool dynamic going on where Gale was like horribly overrated at like the lower end of play, and then at the quote-unquote higher end of play, people would consider him, oh, he's not that good, he's just like a tank counter, he's like whatever brawler, right? But at the highest level of play, people are like, yeah, he's good, right? He's a good solid brawler you can play, and he just so happens to be really brain dead into tanks, right? But I think the general consensus and the mainstream consensus before was that Gale was just this tank counter, right? And he was exclusively used as a tank counter pick, and that's what made him meta. But right now, Gale is seeing like a ton of play on just like a bunch of random maps where Carl is really good. So yes, this is the example that I was going to talk about where this brawler does counter Carl, right? But it's less that you're going to be like, you pick him reactively to Carl, right? And it's more that people are picking him proactively because Gale prevents you from losing to Carl once again. So Gale is now like a top pick on Dueling Beetles, whereas before he was actually kind of bad on Dueling Beetles, right? Ring of Fire, he's seeing a lot more play, right? But the Ring of Fire meta kind of changes every like hour, every day. The Ring of Fire meta changes, so it's hard to tell at this point. But I'm pretty sure Gale is pretty good there right now too. He's seeing a lot more play on Hard Rock Mine, which is kind of crazy. Like over stuff like Surge I'll also get to. But seeing play over Ruffs of all things, right? He's just like a solid power pick, which is kind of insane. Like it's Gale, right? And I think that has more to do with like, okay, so Gale obviously is a preventative measure for like tanks, right? But he also acts as a check to aggression in general. Whereas before that would be like Leon and Max, right? He doesn't really counter them, right? And in some cases, like Max and Leon specifically, they actually do well into him, right? But Gale can just prevent your team from letting them run you over. He can stun a Leon trying to engage on your team, push a Max away, stop a Max push, right? You even choose to run the slowing star power in order to counter Max speed, which is kind of it's a crackpot strategy, but it can work in the right situations, right? But overall, it wasn't that useful, very abusable, not that safe. But now that we have Carl in the meta, that is another aggressive brawler that Gale can act as a preventative measure to. So suddenly, on these maps where these aggressive brawlers, aggressive laners can run rampant, Gale is suddenly a very safe pick, right? Because he gives you like the stopgap to all this aggression, not just... So maybe he doesn't stop Leon or Max that well, but he stops Carl very well, and he stops tanks very well. So he's just collecting all of these niches, which is just making him an overall way more solid brawler, right? And Carl kind of single-handedly had that effect on him. And now I talked about Gene and Gale, right? And they're kind of less extreme examples. But now I want to talk and go a little bit more in-depth into Lou. Of all brawlers, Lou being spammed in NA being the flavor of the month is kind of crazy to me, because Lou, it's been like, ever since Siege got removed, Lou has been just like kind of dumpster, right? He's been pretty underrated for a while, right? He's still like a good hot zone brawler. He's just like a good brawler, right? I think no doubt he was just never mainstream like this for like over a year, right? Or more than that even. So he's never been really mainstream, but right now, it's a few things that's making Lou very mainstream at the moment. So, Lou's niche right now is kind of similar to Gale's, right? Where they are a ranged brawler that likes when you feed their super, they counter tanks, they have this super ability that can be used aggressively or that can be used defensively as a CC ability. just like a defensive range CC brawler with a good super, right? Very similar to Gale. But the difference is that Lu can occupy a slightly different niche than Gale. So just like Gale, so I think, let me talk about Lu first, actually. So Lu, being this like, so he was always underrated, right? He's just like this CC ability brawler, ranged, nice, just a cool brawler. But there was never really a reason to pick him over stuff like B or, well, Gale himself. But now, and I think especially B majorly outclassed him before. But right now, there is a niche that Lu occupies over both of them, which is unlike B, he actually has hard CC in that he actually has a stun, not just a slow, in order to counter aggression, right? Which is very useful into Carl, right? See, Carl still like has this like range damage. It doesn't really care about ranged brawlers that much, but it's the fact that you can just prevent a Carl from doing what he wants using his movement speed with your slip and slide, tagging him up, lowering his damage, and then stunning him out of his super, right? You have all of these useful tools for beating Carl, even though you may not necessarily counter. You know, Lu is a fairly inconsistent brawler with how hard his shots are to hit. But what Lu does better than B is, you know, he has this hard CC. Better than Gale is that he's actually a ranged brawler. So he is somewhere in between Gale and Lu, or Gale and B, sorry. And so Lu has kind of carved out this niche. And whereas before that wasn't needed, like we don't need this hard, we don't need like a hard CC ranged brawler, right? Because we can either just have light CC on a ranged tank counter, and that's enough. Or we have, if we need a hard CC brawler, we have Gale, right? And we don't really need range if we need hard CC. Now we need both, and now Lu is good, right? And it's not even just that Lu beats Carl, right? Because Lu also has useful niches into stuff like Darryl, which is seeing a lot more play, into like fat stuff, Pam, tanks in general, he does fairly well into. He's very good on a lot of choke pointy maps like Kaboom Canyon, Minecart Madness, Safe Zone, right? He's just mechanically good on all of these maps. But before, there was just no reason to play him, no reason to deal with the inconsistency with his shots. But now with Carl existing, suddenly his niche is now tantalizing, right? So the fact that Lu has this ability to not lose to Carl, once again, the Carl effect, he is now becoming a mainstream brawler, even though he didn't get changed at all, and last meta, he was kind of garbage dookie, right? So, Lu, the progenitor of the Carl effect, even though it's called the Carl effect. So that's just like the first example. So we have our CC options. The next things, or like the next type of brawler that got kind of shot into the forefront with Carl coming into the meta are two brawler, or one in particular that I think the casters will really enjoy, and then the other one that's kind of been a little bit more sleeper. So let's talk about that former one first. Darryl is insane right now. Darryl is good on every heist map. Darryl is one of the best tanks, like whenever you just need a tank on Hard Rock Mine, on Brawl Ball, on what have you, Knockout. Darryl is the tank right now, and that's because Darryl is extremely good into Carl, right? So it's less that, so once again, it's not like a Gale thing, so you can pick Darryl reactively into Carl, of course, and that's something you see very commonly, right? But even though he's a tank, people are picking Darryl retroactively in order to overcome a potential Carl pick. It gives you this leverage and this safety that your opponents can't hit Carl, and your comp won't lose to a Carl. So Darryl, once again, he prevents your comp from losing to Carl, right? So he has like, I call it drafting utility, where it's like you pick them early in draft and they do something good for you. In draft, they benefit you more than maybe they benefit you in the actual game. And that's kind of what Darryl does. Darryl was good before, like don't get me wrong, but he was probably not nearly as prolific as he is now. Like I said, Darryl is a necessary, and he probably is always picked in heist right now, even on the ranged maps like Safe Zone and especially Kaboom Canyon, which is crazy to me, that this classically super range, super tank unfriendly map where B and Crow and Pam run rampant, this map suddenly is, excuse me, suddenly Darryl is like the best brawler ever on this map, even though he literally didn't get any changes. And Carl isn't even that good on that map, right? It's just that he has this additional niche that he beats this really solid brawler that really pushes him just like it just pushes him a peg above, right? The fact that he has another niche just makes him that much more tantalizing, right? I think in a similar vein, we have Pam. And Pam, I think, hasn't been being talked about nearly as much as Darryl has, or maybe as something as Lou or as Gale. But Pam was kind of falling off. Like, I know, especially when like we had Fang was OP, when Darryl himself was like broken with steel hoops, or steel hoops being integrated into his main kit, having that 90% shield. Pam was like amazing, and people thought Pam was like this amazing brawler, right? Especially with Scrapsucker being so good. But ever since like tanks became like really super broken, Pam has kind of been like falling off. She's been seeing less play on ranged maps like Bell's Rock and Gold Arm Gulch. She's been seeing less play in Heist, and she hasn't been being prioritized that much in like Gem Grab even. So she's been really falling off. But now Carl himself has a way of beating Pam, which is that Scrapsucker does not stop Carl's super because it doesn't take his ammo, and Carl doesn't particularly care about Scrapsucker in general. But something that is particularly good into Carl is being able to regen HP and just having high HP in general, right? Which are two things that Pam is very good at, right? And now, I don't think anyone is stretching their imagination to call Pam a counter to Carl, right? But what Pam is a preventative measure to losing to Carl, right? So suddenly, Pam is seeing play where Carl is usually like super common, right? Or places where Carl can be picked as a last pick and just screw over your comp. So she's seeing a lot more play on Ring of Fire now, Bell's Rock, Gold Arm Gulch, Hard Rock Mine. All of these maps where Carl is like really insane, like counter pick. Pam is just acting as that preventative measure, right? And by no means was Pam bad before, but it's just, once again, I will keep reiterating, this additional niche that she counters Carl now pushes her that one peg above, right? Now Pam is actually not falling off. She has been re-imbued with life. And so I'm almost done with talking about Carl exclusively, but I also wanted to talk about some miscellaneous brawlers that just don't lose to Carl, right? Well, the first one pretty much just counters Carl, Surge, right? And I remember when let me collect my thoughts really quickly. I remember when the update first came out, a lot of people, including myself, were calling Surge like super broken, right? Power Shield is so broken, Surge is like insane everywhere, better than Gale as a tank counter, right? And that's probably not necessarily true, I don't think. Pros seem to not be prioritizing him that much. Definitely broken on ladder. If you want to get an easy rank 30, play Surge. He is really insane on ladder, especially on a bunch of these new like asymmetrical maps. But Surge is seeing a lot more play on places where he pretty much was never prioritized before. Like, he is actually like a priority pick in sneaky fields now. He's seeing a lot of consistent play on Hard Rock Mine. He's seeing play as a counter pick on Canal Grande of all places. And all of these places, once again, Carl is an insanely safe pick and an insane last pick, counter pick type of deal, right? And Surge counters that, right? So Surge, by proxy, becomes a good brawler, right? And Surge wasn't necessarily bad before, but now he is just a more tantalizing option. Stu, another brawler, very similar situation to Pam. Stu has been falling off for a few months now. He doesn't have DPS with his reload speed, right? He doesn't have stopping power, no CC. And he was really just good at existing, right? He's very good at existing. And that's pretty much just it. So because he had no ability to really change the game necessarily as a laner, maybe, and how there are a bunch of brawlers that do have stopping power and do have more useful utility than Stu. Stu was kind of falling off a little bit. People are playing other assassins like Max and Leon, a lot more stuff like Crow, stuff like Colonel Ruffs, especially still existing as a insane counterpick to Stu, really just made Stu fall off. But now, maybe Carl wasn't the biggest thing to leading to Stu's new domination of the meta, but Stu doesn't lose to Carl, right? Like, he can maneuver around his shots, he can super chain away from his from Carl's super. So Stu just does not lose to Carl, and so that is like very useful utility to have on your team. If you have a laner that doesn't lose to Carl or can just outplay Carl, very good, right? So, and that along with the Ruffs nerf and a bunch of other meta shifts that happened, he was now a very good brawler, right? And you can attribute that to the Carl effect. And then I already briefly mentioned them. Leon and Max both do very well into Carl, but they were already good before, so it's not really that noticeable with them. So, and then there are a few brawlers that actually got worse with the Carl effect, so I'm going to go over these briefly because I also want to talk about some other examples of the Carl effect that are not Carl. So, snipers, and especially first pick snipers on mid-range maps, got way nerfed, right? So, whereas before on a map like Dueling Beetles or Hard Rock Mine or even Ring of Fire, Byron first pick, Bell first pick were super common because they didn't really because Bell and Byron don't really lose mid necessarily. You can outplay pretty much everything, right? And they give you opportunity to just like play a laner, right? You can be the one reacting to the opposing laner, right? But now they are not safe. Bell and Byron are not safe first picks. And that's because Carl can come swinging in. Now, of course, you can ban Carl, but Carl can come swinging in and just assassinate Bell and Byron every single time. And no, it's not like the hardest counter ever, but I don't think anyone's gonna say that Bell or Byron are good into Carl, because Flying Cook is a freaking insane ability that deserves to be, or it deserved to be nerfed like 2 years ago. But yeah, we're seeing a lot less first pick snipers on these mid-range maps. And we're actually seeing also a lot less Piper, because Piper actually loses pretty hard to Carl, right? Again, same thing, Flying Hook in, even if she runs that auto-aimer gadget, the one that knocks Carl back, Carl can generally still just beat her with main attacks. He doesn't even have to super. And getting close to Piper just, obviously hurts her, right? And Flying Hook is exactly that, getting close to people. So we're seeing a lot less Piper, like first picks on maps like Bell's Rock, where there are a lot of cover for Carl to wait in the shadows, wait for the perfect time, and strike. And yeah, so Piper. So snipers and Piper, still amazing brawlers in the meta, right? And that's because of other Carl effects that are going on that I'm going to talk about just in a second. But in terms of their safety, they did get hurt a little bit with Carl, right? And that's because they are checked by Carl himself, or sometimes soft countered. So that was all Carl. And if you hate Carl, that's okay. I'm not going to flame you or anything. I just love Carl and I love what he does to a meta. But Carl isn't the only one that had this like meta changing effect, right? Because if you're aware, Lola and Bo also fit the general description of quote unquote incredibly solid but not broken, right? Generally considered to be like, depending on how people rate it, S tier, A tier brawlers, whatever. Bo and Lola, incredibly good whenever they got into the meta. And very similar in power level even. So why then did they not have as much of an effect? Now, don't get me wrong, they did have an effect on the meta, right? But why was their effect on the meta not so expressed as Carl, right? And I think the easiest way to convey that is by just looking over what checks exist for Bo and Lola. And largely those would be snipers, right? Bell and Byron are very good checks into Lola and Bo because they just outrange them, and that's all you really need in order to beat them. If they can't hit you and you can hit them, that's all you need, right? And especially Belle into Lola is like a soft counter, right? Bo really doesn't like fighting range. Piper does fine into all of them, so anything that can outrange him. And then Squeak also checks them because, you know, he follows the same principle. He can hit them because he can just shoot a shot, walk away, and they can't hit him because he's already walking away after he shoots his shot. So Squeak and snipers, yeah, those are your checks too, or generally, because you can go into more detail into what checks each individual brawler, like, you know, obviously Max and Stu can go around Bo's mines very easily. Leon and like all these high movement speed brawlers deal with Bo in particular, right? But that's generally what you're going to be looking at. Range and Squeak, I guess. So, but I think you can pick up an immediate problem with that. The reason why their Carl effect wasn't that expressed was because snipers are already amazing, right? Snipers have been good for years now, and it's not like a brawler that now exists that suddenly loses to snipers is going to make snipers any better. Maybe it is a little bit, right? But it's not going to like fundamentally change how you think about draft, right? Because these are just samey brawlers that lose to the same things as everything else, right? So the brawlers that they are having a Carl effect on are already good. So that's why it's not as noticeable. And especially Squeak, right? Squeak became insane after he got Residue, right? So obviously, Residue affects his placement in the meta more than just becoming a check to stuff like Lola and Bo, right? Maybe if it didn't receive Residue, maybe we would have seen a lot more Squeak gameplay anyways, because of the Carl effect, but we just couldn't really notice it, right? Because these brawlers are already good. Right? So they didn't have any room to get raised up in the meta, right? And now, even stuff like I mentioned earlier with Bo, high movement speed brawlers like Crow, Leon, and Max are already good. So there is just no, that's why it wasn't that noticeable with both of them. Incredibly solid brawlers. They did have a Carl effect on certain other brawlers, but it wasn't that noticeable because these brawlers are just good anyways. So there wasn't room to change. Right? Now, that's not to say that Lola and Bo didn't change absolutely anything, because with 6 bans especially, certain maps became like a lot, or like especially ranged maps, they became a lot less feast or famine, right? Either you pick you have to pick like super ranged brawlers, or else you just lose to super ranged brawlers, right? Now, Bo and Lola don't necessarily lose to ranged brawlers. Ranged brawlers just don't necessarily lose to them. So Lola and Bo became these super safe picks to pick in place of ranged brawlers, right? To make it less just snipers. Especially on Shooting Star, Bo just became like this super, you know, it's just Bo. He's not like a sniper, but he's not a close range brawler, right? So they did affect the meta, right? By making these ranged maps just a little bit less ranged. But obviously that's not as radical as what Carl's doing to the meta, because Carl is raising these brawlers that are falling in the meta, and he's raising them back up to snuff. Right? Maybe if Lola and Bo didn't exist, or like maybe if Lola's nerfs actually did anything, or if they didn't buff Bo, right? Or if they gave him like an HP buff, whatever. Maybe we would see more of an effect. Like maybe Belle and Byron at this point would be way worse, right? Now, but no, there's no way to tell for sure. But we can always speculate. Speculate. But yeah. But speaking of speculation, this is not just starting with Carl, right? With Lola and Bo, because this Carl effect has been a thing for a while, right? And you can see that with like, the fluctuation in how good Pam has been. Because, okay, if we're gonna talk about history, I need to clear up something really quickly. The Carl effect isn't necessarily with broken brawlers, because what broken brawlers do, or a set of broken brawlers do, is that they warp, the meta, right? It's not like a nudge. They fundamentally change the meta around them to a point where it's just completely unrecognizable because there are certain brawlers that you need to have in order to beat them or just completely ban them out, right? And I think the best example of that, of what is not the Carl effect but could be misinterpreted as the Carl effect, is the Summer of Dinosaurs with the tank trait change, right? Whenever tank trait got changed, right? Suddenly Colette was a top 5 brawler. All of these Gale was bad, right, at that time, but Gale was a top 5 brawler, right? All of these garbage tank counters became good just because they counter tanks, right? Because tanks were so crushingly overpowered at that point, right? So that's not the Carl effect, right? Whereas Carl effect is a nudge. Tank trait making tanks broken was a shove down the stairs and it just a reality warping, meta warping force, right? That's not what the Carl effect is, right? What is the Carl effect is the I think a good example of something similar to Carl is Pam and 8-Bit. So whenever stuff like, especially 8-Bit, but whenever stuff like Pam or 8-Bit is good, you start seeing a lot more like ranged anti-tanks being popular. So Pam was like really insane during the World Finals December 2021, something like that, 2020, I forget. When was Buzz? No, it was 2021. When was Buzz taking over the meta? But Pam was seeing a ton of play because Buzz was broken and Pam counters Buzz, whatever, right? Pam became an incredibly solid brawler at that time, right? And so you saw an advent in things that weren't necessarily bad before, but they just saw a little bit of uptick in usage. Stuff like B became more common in order to beat Pam. Stuff like Colette saw play on like heist maps, even though Colette was like bad at that time, quote unquote. And stuff like Lou even saw play. Stuff like Lou Byron was very common at that point. B, I think I already mentioned. If I didn't, B was also there. These ranged tank counters that could deal with Pam. Maybe soft counter her in some respects, just deal with her in general. They just started seeing a lot more play. And yeah, that's a pretty good example of the Carl effect. Similar thing happened with 8-Bit. So generally 8-Bit is weak to the same things as Pam, but more. So we saw, well, and in addition to stuff like Brock, right, which has like splash damage, really likes that slow movement speed on him. So you would see like an advent of things like B and Colette like being played in places where Colette should not be played. Like when 8-Bit's good on Hard Rock Mine, like broken, like that time when what's its face? When Plugged In got released, Colette started seeing play in Hard Rock Mine again, where she didn't for like a year prior, or time is hard. At least 6 months prior, Colette started seeing play because Colette historically has been a check at least, or a soft counter to 8-Bit because she just chunks them for a lot of damage, right? B started seeing more play on random maps, right? Brock started seeing play on Hard Rock Mine also, and it was wild, right? Piper, stuff that really dealt with 8-Bit's early game and really abused his early game, started seeing a lot more play because 8-Bit was just an incredibly solid brawler, right? And well, now this gets me to thinking, what if we had a meta where Pam, Bonnie, 8-Bit, and Carl were all top 10 brawlers, right, at the same time? We're almost there. We're almost there. But what if they were all top 10 brawlers at the same time? How crazy would that meta be? All of these high HP ranged brawlers, how good do you think B would be at that point? How good do you think Lou would be? You think Lou's good now? But anyways, yeah. So it's just, I think it's pretty interesting to think about. And yeah, I think I've talked about Carl for long enough, and whether you hate the brawler now because I've said his name at least 30 times in this video, or if you love him even more and appreciate him even more like I do, well, let me know. And yeah, this has been Carl Main's Carl video. And unfortunately we did not get to talk about politics this time, but if you're interested in that, I still have video ideas, and for legal reasons, that is a joke. But anyways, if you've enjoyed, please comment down below and like the video, subscribe, share with anyone you would think would be interested in this type of content. And you guys that watch my videos regularly, you guys are cool AF. So I think I've prolonged this long enough. Just waiting to get to 40. There we go. Thank you very much. See you later.